people today might say, I mean, I've even read some stuff and say, well, maybe aliens came down and did it. I mean, I've seen stuff like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to three things. Okay. And this, people can check out Lydia McGrew and Timothy McGrew. They have some really good work on
Lydia
this.
McGrew?
Lydia McGrew, right. And so she calls this her, I think, McGrewian trilemma. I think if you want to be funny about it, but specific about it.
She's a wordsmith.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit, So either the disciples...
yourself.
either the disciples lied,
Yeah.
or they were mistaken, or they were telling the truth. Either they lied, they were mistaken, or they were telling the truth. Now, what we want to do is land on which of those options are most plausible, most likely to be the case.
Absolutely.
Right? That's what we want to land on, right? Now, is it likely that they lied? Okay, now there's going to be two tools that we use to evaluate these three options. One is context, the other one is content. Okay. Now, so to evaluate whether they lied or not, let's talk about context. Again, we're talking about a group of folks who just saw their leader crucified, right? Romans were really good at finding and killing people.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like that, there's no doubt about that. And so, and we also know that the Jewish leaders were in cahoots, with the Romans to accomplish that. Because you got to remember that the Hebrews were a conquered people at this time. They were subject to Rome.
Yeah.
And so the Jewish leaders at the time was like, look, we don't want anybody messing up what we have.
Right.
So if somebody's going to mess it up, we're going to send them up to the Romans so shut it down, right? We ain't trying to get ourselves ousted as well. And so the first believers, the apostles, they had every reason to believe that the context that they were in was hostile to what it is they were trying to say. Okay. They had every reason to believe that if we proclaim this message, it might be a wrap, right? But nevertheless, they did. They proclaimed this thing publicly. It wasn't like in secret caves or in secret back meetings. They was on the streets proclaiming it publicly to people with whom they had good reason to believe might take their life, right? They're also proclaiming a message that was radically different. People, bro. Right. And so they're also proclaiming a message that was somewhat out of step with what the audience would have probably accepted. And what I mean by that is, at that time, the idea of Messiah was somebody who's supposed to come and wreck shop on the oppressors, like militarily. Somebody was supposed to come through, throw off Roman occupation. We out of here. We back to being on top. That's what they thought it was going to be, prior to Jesus' time. So the disciples would come along and say, no. The Messiah was somebody who conquered something not militarily, but it was actually through his death that he conquered. That's not something that a first century Jew would be like, oh yeah, let me get on board with that. So they're proclaiming an unwanted message to people who don't want the message. And violently so. So the likelihood that they would be lying in that instance at their own peril is very unlikely. It's not likely to be the case.
That's a thing too. Like there was no mega church job for them to get.
There wasn't no money.
There was no book sale for this.
Per diem.
If you don't shut up, the same thing's gonna happen to you.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
And the fact is, there was an easy out because even prior to Jesus coming along, there had been other people who rose up proclaiming to be the Messiah. And then, that movement would just die out or what have you. And then whoever was following, they would just go back to their regular life. Be like, cool, we missed it. Let's get back to it. You know what I mean? So there was an out for the disciples. They didn't have to go for
the sheep.
That's it. That's it. And matter of fact, that's what the Pharisees said. Like, yo, if this is not of God, it's going to dissipate anyway. Right? So the apostles could have easily done. They could have been like, all right, cool, let's just go back to regular life. They didn't have to proclaim publicly this message that would get them killed. And nevertheless, they did. So then on top of that, there's no record of any sort of like variance. I mean, like some people use the example with Richard Nixon, when Watergate, when that all went down, how, once people start getting yoked up, everybody starts singing, everybody snitching. You know what I'm saying? Like there's no record of that like whatsoever. If there was, then we would have, we probably would have record of it because the Babylonian Talmud, which comes along later, Jewish persons who are still anti-Jesus are documenting things that they ain't like about him. So if there was all this beef going on, then there's a good reason to believe that would be there. So all that to say, I know I'm speaking quickly, it's not likely that they lied. That's not a likely option. Now, could they have been mistaken? Now, I promise you right now, if one of y'all died, like, God forbid, one of y'all got shot or something like that, and then I see you 3 days later, bro, I promise you I'm gonna remember that.
Yes, sir.
Like we gonna have, my memory will be very vivid. I mean, but just to kind of make it more relatable, you have what's called an impact memory. So like 9/11, for example, for people who are old enough to have been alive when that happened. Like I can tell you where I was, what I was doing, what we was talking about when, that day. I can tell you all about it because it's what you call an impact memory. So likewise, when it comes to this event, that changed the disciples' lives, is it likely that they were just being mistaken about it? No, they probably have a real good possession of what occurred. I mean, but aside from that, probably the most, if we're going to deal with objections to an extent, the main objection maybe to what I'm saying at this point would be something like maybe they hallucinated. Some people want to go with that.
Yeah, I'm glad
Multiple though, like.
Well, I mean that was interesting, right? Now mental health is actually my background. I'm a social worker by trade, and so I've worked with people who have hallucinations, and that's I've got a lot of experience with that. But even aside from that, we can just look in the literature and say when you look at the content, this is where we're going to get to that second tool. We talked about context to address the lie hypothesis, and now in terms of being mistaken, we'll talk about content. If you look at the content of what they were claiming, right? They're claiming that Jesus did things like met with them in groups, spoke to them as a group, responded to what they said,
made breakfast
ate
on the
with
beach.
them, made breakfast on the beach,
This is after he died.
This is after he died, right? Yeah. So this would have to be what you call a multimodal hallucination,
Right. Because you got multiple people seeing this.
Touch, hearing,
That too,
all of the above.
Because everybody ain't gonna have the same hallucination.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So in the same way that we can't all, like, if I say I'm gonna dream about going to Vegas tonight or something like that, you know what I mean? And I say to my wife, hey, let's go to Vegas. Like she can't get in my dream, you know what I'm saying? Because it's in me. That's the nature of hallucination.
Yeah, imagine hard enough.
Right. And so the idea that you have this group of people, not just like 2 or 3 dudes, I mean, who was maybe had some shrooms or something like that. We're talking about 500 plus people who all attest and are willing to die for this statement.
Willing to die.
Willing to die. Some of whom did, right? Yeah. As a matter of fact, with the earliest, if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, Paul even says, like, look, it's 500 people. You can go talk to them right now.
Go talk to them.
They're in Jerusalem, right? Yeah. And so it's not likely, that you have this mass multimodal hallucination, like something like that. In terms of the literature that we have on mental health and so forth, it's like unheard of. Like it's just not. It's not the case. It's not a viable.
Because even from what I've been told, now, I don't know nothing about this, but even like they say when you smoke weed, if you get 2 people that's smoking weed together, they're not gonna all have the same vision. And whatever. Now that's from what I heard.
Yeah, I heard about.
You don't know anything about it.
I don't know nothing about none of that. From what I heard.
Is that how you quoted the lyrics so quickly?
Go ahead.